Thank you, Sophie, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for being here this morning. Delighted to introduce this text and inquire why we ought to study it. So please make yourself comfortable. Maybe grab a cup of tea if you want one. And we'll start with the slides. So the text is called the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita translates as the Song of Victory. Next slide, please. The title can be broken down into three parts. Bhaga means victory or wealth. It also implies a person, so a sharer of good fortune. And the suffix vat means as or like. So bhagavat means victory as. And then Gita means song. Gita. When you combine Bhagavat with Gita, there is what's called Sandhi, a list of joining principles that transforms the hard T to a soft G. And that's how we get Bhagavad Gita. The Gita begins with the G, the Bhagavat ends with the T, and that turns the T to a D. Next slide, please. Well, yeah, that one. So this is an introduction to the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of Victory. Next slide, please. There are many yoga-related texts that are worth studying. Here are just a few. And in YSI, Yoga Studies Institute, we're starting with these three. Next slide, please. So far, we've done the Yoga Sutra, the Hatha Yoga Pradipaka, and now we'll be exploring the Bhagavad Gita. If you notice, the dates for this text predates the Yoga Sutra by potentially a couple centuries. Next slide, please. Why study the Bhagavad Gita? This text has quite a rich history, and it is much bigger than the Yoga Sutra. It is 700 verses, 18 chapters, and it contains a lot of many rich gems of wisdom. Next slide, please. But here are three reasons that I'll ask you to consider, allowing you to agree or disagree. One, studying the Bhagavad Gita can help us better understand how yoga works, especially in the context of conflict. The story that surrounds the Bhagavad Gita is called the Mahabharata, which we'll get to in a minute. But it's a tale of two families that end up going to war. And the Bhagavad Gita takes place right before the war begins. This can be thought of as a metaphor or for an allegory of some difficult times in our own life where we have to make really tough decisions and how our nervous system tends to shut down as a result of that. Yoga can help us get back on our feet and persevere. Next slide. In addition, studying the Bhagavad Gita offers much more perspective on how yoga was practiced 2,000 years ago, how it can be practiced today, and beyond into the future that is not so easy to see clearly. There's a lot of myths in the world that yoga was only for Brahmins, the privileged caste. But if we listen to the Yoga Sutra, it seems like yoga was actually intended for anyone or everyone, not just those in positions of privilege or power. Next slide, please. Although the Gita is a poem, it is a very beautiful poem. It was meant to be sung in meter. It also presents a basic moral ethical theory called Bhakti that can uniquely help us overcome trauma. I'm noticing a typo in my slides. I'll fix that. But more on that in a second. Next slide, please. Bhakti is often confused with theism. Theism is a form of virtue ethics that suggests devotion to a good or strong person produces what is right. Bhakti is the exact opposite theory. Devotion to right action produces a good or strong person. One does not have to believe in gods or any kind of dogma to practice bhakti yoga, devotion to right action. So I've put a chart here of other basic moral ethical theories that we'll explore in a minute, just so that you can see that bhakti doesn't fit into the well-established ones that we know of West. Next slide, please. Here is a quote from Dr. Shyam Ranganathan, who has written and published many peer-reviewed papers on the Bhagavad Gita and moral philosophy. He also translated the Yoga Sutra for Penguin Books back in 2008. And here he says, research isn't about uncovering what people believe. So research into South Asian philosophy and yoga is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a delve into traditional beliefs about yoga. It's about uncovering what is objective, what we can converge on as we disagree. My research in philosophy has led me to discover that ethics, morality, the Tao, Dharma, is all about the right or the good. And ethical theory takes different perspectives on this concept. Virtue ethics claims that the good character produces the right choice. Yoga or bhakti is the opposite. The right devotion to the procedural ideal, Ishvara, leads to or produces the good, perfection or practice. Theism, the belief that there is an all good all-powerful, all-knowledgeable God is a version of virtue ethics. The Lord, sovereignty, Ishvara, is a procedural abstraction of what it is to be a person. And devotion to this ideal transforms our life into one that expresses our own sovereignty and the sovereignty of others. Western colonization of yoga involves understanding yoga in terms of theories and worldviews familiar to the West, such as theism. Yoga, in contrast, is atheistic, non-theism, because it's the opposite of virtue ethics. Dr. Ranganathan is a professor of philosophy at York University and teaches yoga philosophy in many ways. Next slide, please. So here is the basic moral ethical theories that you can find in the Bhagavad Gita and beyond. The first two on the top are teleological, which is a fancy way of saying outcome driven. The reason why we make our choices is because we're attached to a specific outcome. So virtue ethics, noticed as the good virtue or strength produces the right action. This is where we act because we're attached to looking good or being perceived as good. Whereas consequentialism, the good end justifies the right means. Here, we're not as attached to looking good, but we're attached to the good outcome, getting what we want. And these types of moral ethical theories are so common in the West and even in the East that we sometimes don't even see them until your nervous system starts to freak out that you're not going to get the good outcome that you're attached to. There are other ways that we can navigate dilemmas, and the bottom two, deontology and bhakti, are process oriented. So it's devotion to a certain procedure regardless of the outcomes. These two moral ethical theories allow us to practice without being attached to the results. And although deontology is very well understood in the West, bhakti is not. And it is often confused with virtue ethics. So I hope by this introduction, we might be able to dispel some confusion about this. Next slide. Let's look at what happens to Arjuna, the main character of this text, when he realizes that he has to fight a war where he's not going to end up looking good, whether he wins or loses, and he's not going to have a good outcome. And in the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna makes some pretty strong points about why war is stupid. And even though he's a warrior, he does not want to fight. I'm sure we can all relate to some of the things that he says in the first chapter. I can't wait to explore it more with you. But let's just say that this text is also an allegory of not just that specific war several thousand years ago, but rather for us showing up to our life situation as it is. And instead of running away when it gets hard, standing and fighting the good fight. So here is a quote from the first chapter. Apameva shayedasma avatanatayana tasmanarhavayum hantum dhartarashtran sabandhavan swajanam hi katam hatva sukhina hasyam madhava. The translation: only evil will come upon us by killing these aggressors. Therefore, it is not proper to kill the sons of Dhritarashtra or their friends. How exactly can we become happy by killing our kinsman, Krishna? The Bhagavad Gita was composed in classical Sanskrit, and it's a lot easier to translate than the Yoga Sutra. Everything is in complete sentences. But one of the most common problems with studying the Bhagavad Gita is that it's presented out of context. A lot of readers don't understand what happened in the Mahabharata that led up to this conversation between Arjuna and Krishna. Next slide, please. So in this course, we're going to help set the scene so that you can appreciate the gems of wisdom the Bhagavad Gita has to offer with context. The Mahabharata is a text that's about 100,000 pages long. Or I'm sorry, 100,000 verses long, maybe 200,000 verses. And the Bhagavad Gita happens in the middle of it. Simply put, it's a conflict between two families. On one side, you have the Pandavas, where Arjuna comes from. The Sanskrit for Pandavas would be Pandavaha. And they're led by Arjuna's brothers. He has two older brothers, Yudhishthira, who becomes king, Bhima, the strongest of the Pandavas, Arjuna, who's the best archer, Nakula, who is the most good-looking, and Sahadeva, who is the smartest. And on the other side, you have the Kauravas. The Sanskrit is Kauravaha, which is made up of the blind king, Dhritarashtra, the leader. He was born blind. Duryodhana is the person who wants to take power. And Karna, who is a charioteer's child that became a warrior. Dushasana, who is Duryodhana's younger brother, and over 100 other brothers. And this side would be representing the people who are after power and owning land, whereas the Pandavas are more interested in preserving peace and making sure that everyone has what they need. So this conflict is based on, let's just say, a mixture of historical fact and myth. And no one knows for sure where one begins and where the other ends. So this war could have actually happened some thousands of years ago. Could have been made up, maybe somewhere in between. Next slide, please. The Mahabharata is made up of 18 books. And the backstory that we often don't get when we read the Bhagavad Gita is in the first 5 books. So Earl has promised us that he'll help us appreciate what happened before in bite-sized chunks so that we can appreciate the richness of the Bhagavad Gita, which happens in book 6, right before the war begins. Some historians say that the Bhagavad Gita used to be much shorter than it is today, as this whole Mahabharata was written to be performed live in front of an audience as a play. But nowadays, it's written down and is a very rich history that contains many moral, ethical lessons in every part of every chapter. Next slide, please. So what ends up happening to Arjuna is he has to fight this battle or his side will lose. He is the most valuable player, the MVP, as we say. And if he doesn't fight, then the other side will certainly win. When he gets up to the front lines, his charioteer happens to be none other than Krishna, who appears in the form of a man whom he had known for 20 years, looked up to as a mentor. However, a lot of people were saying that Krishna was not an ordinary person. Lots of coincidences and miraculous events happens around Krishna. So Arjuna asks Krishna to take his chariot to the front lines where he can see the other side and see who actually shows up to fight this fight. And when he realizes the people he has to fight are his own family, his own teacher, his nervous system rebels. And he describes that his limbs are shaking, his breath is disturbed as it goes in and out. His body is overwhelmed with despair, and unhappy thoughts are attacking him. Then he describes why he will not fight. That's basically chapter 1. Chapter 2, we get to hear Krishna's response to Arjuna. Here is a very important piece of wisdom that Krishna offers to Arjuna. Karmanyeva dikaraste ma paleshu kadachana ma karma phala hetur bhurma te sangostat akarmani. You have to fight. Sorry, you have a right to act. You have a right to act, but never at any time are you entitled to the fruits. Never confuse yourself as the cause of the action's fruits or become attached to inactivity. So here, right out the gate, Krishna is describing a different moral ethical theory than what Arjuna is used to. He's used to being the best at what he does, also making sure that people know that he's the best. And he's also used to getting what he wants. And in this war, he can't do either of those. None of those are on the table. And his nervous system just shuts down. Next slide, please. So if all you have available to you are these teleological, outcome-oriented, moral ethical theories, your nervous system is likely to get tangled in knots when a dilemma comes to you that doesn't allow you to have a good outcome. The other two, deontology and bhakti, can also produce good outcomes. However, they're not attached to them. And it's these moral ethical theories that can help us practice in times where there is no clear good outcome that awaits us. Deontology is the right reason justifies the good action or omission. That's one way to understand it. I think an easier way is devotion to a rule. So examples of deontology might be like the judicial system, where we're going to follow these rules. Whether the outcome is good or bad, we're just going to stick to these rules. Same with business. You got a policy, and whether or not that policy produces a good or a bad result, this is our policy. The utility of deontology is that it can take some of the pressure off of a person and focus it more on the rule. When that rule, however, is considered to be a good rule, then it becomes virtue ethics, where it's devotion to this good rule. And what, whether or not you agree, that's how we're going to be. So in the time that Arjuna and Krishna are assembled on this battlefield, there are a lot of rules of war that, for example, you can only fight once the sun is risen, and fighting stops when the sun goes down. You can't attack a person when their back is turned to you. Many rules like this are a part of that story, and deontology would be devotion to rules. This is what sometimes is meant by karma yoga, devotion to just selfless service, doing as much good as you can without being attached to the outcomes, which is a step in the right direction, but not necessarily bhakti. So let's go to the next slide and take a closer look at this verse from the Bhagavad Gita, the 3rd chapter. This one is so good that I'll even encourage you to memorize it. Not that you have to, but if you want to, it's good to know what it is that you're memorizing. So in this upcoming course, I've been asked to teach Sanskrit, and I will happily help you learn to read and write the Sanskrit language and understand the grammar enough where you can appreciate this wisdom. in this language as well as your own, or the ones you're familiar with. So let's start off with the first word of this verse. Please say yaha. It's a pronoun, and it means one, specifically one who. And then tu means but. So it should be, when you combine yaha and tu, it turns to yastu. However, the next word is indriya. Please say indriya. Indriya would be the senses, or the sense, such as sight, hearing, taste, and so on. But when you talk about many senses, there's a declension on indriya that turns to indriyani. So indriyani means the senses. And according to Sandhi, when you combine yaha, tu, and indriyani, it turns to yastvindriyani. Yastvindriyani. So one who but the senses. Please say manasa. So manas is the mind. And manasaha means by the mind. So yastvindriyani manasa. One but the senses by the mind. And then here's a word that you might recognize. Niyamya. Kind of sounds like the second limb of yoga, right? So niyama means to hold the reins of the mind and practice self-determination. As does niyamya. So it means regulating. And regulating the senses is another limb of yoga, right? Does anyone remember which limb regulating the senses would be? Well, we can treat that as a rhetorical question. But yes, it's the fifth limb. And then please say arabate. Arabate. Arabate means begins. And Arjuna is the archer, who's one of the two main characters of this conversation. And his name is abbreviated here in that first line, again, due to what's called Sandhi. So when you combine Arabate and Arjuna, the gets replaced with an apostrophe. So you just say Arabate Arjuna. So the first line reads, O Arjuna, one who tries to control the active senses by the mind. Let's get to the next line so you can understand the action part. Let's go back to the previous slide, please. Thank you. So please say karma. I have a feeling you know what that means. So karma means action and can often imply the results of our actions. And then when you combine karma with indriya, the sense, it turns to karmendriya, because in karma and e in indriya turns to a. So you get karmendriya. And then we have a different declension here on indriya, it's indriyahi. Indriyahi, as I'll teach you the declensions if you come to the Bhagavad Gita course. It implies that it's plural and it's in the instrumental case. So it's by the active senses. Karmendriyahi. And then we have karma yoga. So karma, what we do, what we think, what we say, comes back to us in the same way. Maybe not right away, but in time. When one understands these rules or how things are, karma yoga would be devotion to, instead of letting karma control your life, you basically determining your own karma. So karma yoga here is a step in the direction towards bhakti, understanding bhakti as a basic moral ethical theory. And then please say asaktaha. Asaktaha. That's a good word. Asaktaha means without attachment. Without attachment, in the sense where when you do something good comes back to you. You probably want to keep doing that again. But when you do something bad and something bad happens to you, you'll probably want to stop doing that. Like putting your hand on a hot stove. Ouch, I'm not going to do that again. The confusion, however, is in what's called the time lapse, where you plant the seed and many months later it ripens. Sometimes you don't necessarily see clearly that the good action produced a good result, the bad action produced a bad result. And we might get confused and think that the good action produced a bad result, or the bad action produces a good result. So karma yoga is choosing to sort out that confusion and start to take control over your actions. Next word is savishishyate. So sa just means saha, which is the pronoun for he, meaning a person. And vishishyate, vishishyate is by far the better. So when we plant a seed and we expect it to ripen a certain way, sometimes we get attached to that outcome, and we think that we alone caused that outcome. As a person, it's worth noting that yes, maybe you did plant the seed, but you alone aren't necessarily responsible for the soil or the water or the weather or all of the other events that occur between the planting of the seed and its ripening. And therefore, one should still plant good seeds, but one does not need to be attached to the outcome. One can merely focus all of their attention on the planting of the seed. And whatever result comes, you can learn from that and make better choices. So this verse, which introduces karma yoga as a form of bhakti, is so good that I thought you might want to sing it with me. If I'm wrong about that, you don't have to sing it, but if you'd like to, feel free to repeat after me. Yasvindriyani manasa niyamyara paterjana karmendriyahi karma yogam saktaha sakhishyate. Sing it with me if you want. Yasvindriyani manasa niyamyara bhakti jana karmendriyahi karma yogam saktaha savichishyati. Yasvindriyani manasa niyamyara paterjana karmendriyahi karma yogam saktaha savichishyate. O Arjuna, one who tries to control the active senses by the mind and begins devotion without attachment is by far the better. One more time. Yasvindriyani manasa niyamyara paterjana karmendriyahi karma yogam asaktaha savishishyate. O Arjuna, one who tries to control the active senses by the mind and begins devotion without attachment is by far the better. Next slide, please. One of the ways that I think one can understand the Bhagavad Gita, rather than just believing Krishna or whoever talks about it, but thinking for yourself and making your own choices, is that it is not necessarily a war between people, but rather an inner conflict between ourselves and the kleshas, the afflictions that plague people. So in the allegory of Veda Vyasa, who's the author of this text, Veda Vyasa historically is the person who not only wrote the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata, but he also organized the Vedas in the way that we know them today. Vedavyasa is also a character in this story, and he is the father of both Pandu, the father of the Pandavas, and Dhritarashtra, the father of the Kauravas. So Vedavyasa is the grandfather of Arjuna and his cousins. And in that, you could say that this conflict, especially if it's a fictional story, is all happening within Vedavyasa. And Arjuna and his brothers represent the good guys, sometimes called the friends of the Dharma, or Panchabala, which would be Shraddha, Virya, Smrti, Samadhi, and Prajna. Anyone recognize this list from the Yoga Sutra? I know Earl does, But if this isn't ringing any bells, I'll remind you in the Yoga Sutra, the first chapter, the Samadhipada, Patanjali says if we want to not just calm our mind, but rather tame our mind to be free of kleshas, then we're going to need these 5 things. So the first one is Shraddha, which is confidence that it can even be done. The second is Virya, the hard work to transform afflicted states of mind into being unafflicted. Smrti, which is the mindfulness or remembering to stay focused on what we are, what we're doing, even as numerous distractions arise. And Samadhi would be profound meditation, where we discern the seer and the seen. So instead of reacting to the contents of our mind, we can abide in our own form and become a master gardener of the mind. Prajna is the wisdom that allows us to not only do just that, but comes from whenever you empower other people to do the same thing. If you think you know something well, try teaching someone else to do it till they're competent. And you'll have to learn it all over again. In Buddhism, these are also known as the 5 paths of meditation. Thank you, Earl. And in this text, these 5 friends have been personified as 5 brothers. So basically, they're 5 fingers in the same hand. And I won't get into it too much, but they all end up marrying the same woman, Panchali, or Draupadi. And she is like the palm that holds the 5 brothers together. Lots of beautiful metaphor there. And on the other side, we have the Kauravas, who represent the kleshas, the 5 kleshas. And these are who we're up against. The first one is vidya, which means ignorance, ignorance of our ignorance, the root cause of all suffering. Like, not only do we not know that this bad thing we did was the result of this bad experience we had, we think it was the good thing that caused the bad experience. And we think the bad thing we did actually causes a good experience. And therefore we perpetuate in causing our future suffering while thinking we're doing the opposite. That's a vidya, misunderstanding. And in this story, it's played by the blind king. Not blind by choice, but born blind. And then Duryodhana represents asmita. Asmita is egotism, where instead of taking responsibility for shaping our mind, we're identified with our mind, and the mind controls us. So we're very attached to looking good in public, very attached to getting what we want, and almost shut down when neither of those options become available. So asmita is, in the Yoga Sutra, the root of the problem to be eliminated. And yoga, by contrast, is instead of identifying with your mind, creating some space between the seer and the seen so you can take responsibility for shaping the mind so that you suffer less and thrive more. Karna, who is actually Arjuna's oldest brother of the same mother, he ended up being given up for adoption. And he represents raga, craving, uncontrolled craving. So when we're identified with our craving, it controls us. And unfortunately, Karna Although he has a good heart, he is controlled by his craving and easily manipulated by Duryodhana. And he's the last person to realize this until he's no longer identified with his craving. And then Dvesha is aversion, and Dushasana is a representation of aversion. There's nothing wrong with wanting to put some distance between you and something intelligently. But when you're identified with that aversion, it controls you. And then you sometimes end up putting some distance between you and the very thing that you need to thrive or even survive. And then the Abhinivesha is what's called clinging or attachment, or some say it's the fear of death. Later on in the Tantric Hatha Yoga texts, it meant a grunti, a knot that your nervous system gets tied into that becomes difficult to untangle. We think of that in modern times as trauma, or what's called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, where our nervous system gets tied in knots. And then anytime we think about that topic, the knot just gets tighter. And even though the event of the knot being tied is in the past, we take it with us everywhere we go. Okay. So, in a way, your practice of yoga is showing up to the battlefield of your mind. And instead of letting these kleshas rule your life and take over everything and everyone that you love, it's standing to fight the good fight of practicing self-determination, stopping the causes of suffering, promoting the causes of wellness instead. That's the lens that I'll offer to you to see this text and appreciate its wisdom, and you can choose to agree or disagree. Next slide, please. The Bhagavad Gita will be live streamable February 6th through 10th, and I'm delighted to be a part of this course and to explore these teachings with you. Thank you so much for inviting me out this morning to introduce this text. I did my best. So, I'm sure the other presenters will add much more richness to their view of this text. Thank you.